Our guest today has a provocative thesis about the reason for the tribalism in our politics, the lawlessness in our courts, and the crisis of meaning rampaging in our culture. As a lawyer, he has been involved in some high-profile cases over the past few decades, and even litigated one case all the way to the Supreme Court. Barry Arrington is the author of the new book, Unforgetting God, and he's here to talk about it. Barry, thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having me, Sean. It's quite an honor. Thank you.
So a mutual friend of ours, William Dembski, who's been a friend of mine for decades, we co-authored a book on intelligent design together, sent me your book, and he said, Sean, you might want to read this. I read it and was like, this is really interesting. I would love to have Barry on. So let me just jump right in. Before we get to the provocative thesis, kind of at the heart of your work, tell us about the case you litigated to SCOTUS, because I want people to understand your background and legal training that you bring to this discussion.
Okay. So in 2020, I had a church come to me and they had been shut down by the state of Colorado. I mean, basically the COVID pandemic was in full force, and Colorado had passed these regulations shutting churches down. Now, initially, people were kind of, well, maybe we can give them the benefit of the doubt. This is a new thing that we're dealing with. But as time progressed, they opened up the stores and they opened up the marijuana dispensaries and they opened up this and that. But they kept the churches shut down. And so it's time to go to court. And in the spring of 2020, I filed a case in the federal district court, promptly lost. The court denied my motion to overturn the Colorado regulations, keeping churches closed. I appealed to the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals, the next court below the Supreme Court, above the district court, lost there too. Because in the summer of 2020, I don't know if you remember this, Calvary Chapel of Dayton Valley and had come around, and we get the famous quote from Gorsuch saying, well, Caesar's palace is open, but Calvary Chapel's is closed. There's no world in which the First Amendment allows that to happen. Yet, right. Nevertheless, in a 5-4 vote, it happened. And then Justice Ginsburg died. And while my case was pending and Justice Barrett was appointed, and through a series of events, we got to a place where in a case out of New York, the Roman Catholic Diocese of Brooklyn, they decided that case initially where they forced New York to open up all of its churches. And a couple of weeks later, they granted cert in my case, and ultimately were able to force the Colorado government to open up the churches in Colorado as well.
Well, I have a million questions for you, what it's like to argue or put a case before the Supreme Court, but that'll be a conversation for another time. This book, you're really trying to kind of diagnose what you think is at the root of tribalism, lawlessness, the lack of meaning, but it really is, to put your cards on the table, this is an apologetics book in which you're making the case for the Christian faith. So again, before we get to your thesis and let you lay out your case for it, I'm really curious, your personal journey to the Christian faith. Did reasoning and the kind of evidence in this book play a role in it?
So I grew up in a Christian household. I was blessed to have Christian parents who had me in the church early. And so I can't say that apologetics per se led me to faith in Christ. But I can tell you what it did do is as the onslaught of materialism and the onslaught of Darwinism washed over me as I made my way through the secular education system, especially in the university, especially in the law schools. My dad was like a rock that I could cling to as those waves washed over me. And one of the things that we talked about over and over again are these apologetic issues. And I would go and we'd talk it through, and I was able to survive that onslaught against my faith, which so many students, as you well know, Sean, lose their faith in university. I was able to use the apologetic answers to a lot of those questions that are available that just some students sadly are not able or not inclined to take advantage of.
Okay, so quick question. I just did a video recently where I asked 100 apologists what they considered their best single argument for the existence of God. If they had to pick one, off the top of your head, if you had to pick one as a lawyer, which one would you pick?
Well, Sean, I cheated because I saw that video and I
Oh,
saw all the answers.
okay. Fair
And
enough.
amongst the answers that were given, I think Doug Groteis's answer was the best in
Oh,
my
okay.
personal view,
Okay.
because he said there's no one answer. It's cumulative. And I think the best
Fair enough.
evidence for the existence of God is that there is so many different strands for the existence of God. There's a phrase in the law that we call the totality of the evidence. When
Mm.
you're presenting a case to a jury, you don't focus on just the evidence that supports you or just the evidence for the other side. You weave it all into one thematic thread, and you let the totality of the evidence, rather than one or two things, uh, kind of tell a story. But to be fair, if I had to pick
Ah,
one
okay.
single thing that really speaks to me, it's Leibniz. It's Leibniz. Why is there
Oh,
something rather than nothing?
amazing.
And
All right. I love
that's
it.
the one that I always come back to.
All right. At some point, man, I have so many questions for you. I'd love to unpack, but let's start moving closer to your thesis in your book. Again, the title is provocatively called Unforgetting God. Now, you had a role in defending some of the families in the Columbine High School massacre. I remember this well, Barry. I was traveling with my father right out of college. I graduated in 98. I think this was 99 was when the massacre was. I saw the personal devastation that caused on his life. And he actually assigned me as his assistant. He said, I want you to read every reason why somebody says this happened. Is it video games? Is it the lack of a father? Is it bullying in school? So I spent hours and hours reading all this stuff, putting a report together for him. So when you talked about being involved in this and some of the motivation behind it, especially carefully researching Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, the two murderers behind this, my ears perked up. So what was your role kind of in that case? And what do you think was the heart of the motivation that led him to the Columbine massacre?
It's a good question, Sean. And just a little bit of background. Several of the families whose children were killed that day approached our firm, and we, through a series of events, we wound up representing them. And as a result, I took a very deep dive into that incident, hundreds of hours, thousands
Mm,
of pages of documents, videos, audio, recording, some of the stuff that you might not have had access to. Because I was involved in the lawsuit, had
yeah.
access to. And after that extremely deep dive into Eric Harris's, and I focus on Eric Harris because anyone who
Okay.
knows anything about Columbine knows that Eric was the leader, Klebold was the follower. He
Mm,
was the mastermind. He was the brains behind the project. And it turns out it's fairly simple what motivated Eric Harris. He was not insane. He was a psychopath, but he wasn't insane. He wasn't trying to, avenge himself of bullying. He was basically acting upon principles that he had learned. He had taken classes in philosophy, and he took his materialism very seriously indeed. He had also studied Nietzsche, and there's one of his writings. I love Nietzsche. And so if you want to know what motivated Eric Harris, you should just take his own personal word for it. And in the book, I quote from one of his writings, which kind of summarizes it. And I'll quote from it again, and I'll expletive deleted. There's lots of
okay.
expletives here, but if there's one quotation that sums up Harris's views, it is probably this one: F money, F justice, F morals, F civilized, F rules, F laws. Die, man-made words. He shouts, die. People think they apply to everything when they don't, can't. There's no such thing as true good or true evil. It's all relative to the observer. It's all just nature, chemistry, and math. And so if you see that written down and you look at the basement tapes where he's talking with Klebold and again the totality of the evidence, Eric Harris's motivation was materialism funneled through Darwinism, funneled through Nietzsche, and fundamentally Columbine was a massive act of Nietzschean will. Eric Harris thought he was an Ubermensch, and this is the way he was going to demonstrate it.
It's really a chilling claim to make, and it's kind of amazing. If we want to be able to, address issues like this, we got to diagnose it properly. And I haven't heard a lot of people say what you said. Now, of course, I did not have access to those files. I was reading newspapers and magazines and listening to news coverage of this. So that gives you a very different perspective. But you said materialism is at the root of this. I'm just going to define it the way you do in your book, just so people know what you're talking about, because that word can mean different things. You say it's the idea that matter moved by mindless forces explains all of reality. So there's no supernatural realm. All can be reduced down to or explained by matter and material forces in motion. This is what Nietzsche believed. This is what Eric Harris believed, and he described as the justification for this massacre. Now, describe what's the thesis then at the heart of your book?
Okay, so chapter 2 is called Materialism 101, where I go into what do materialists actually believe. And as you just indicated, you summarized there, they believe that all of reality can be reduced to it's a very reductionist theory, that it can be reduced to the fundamental forces operating on the fundamental particles. Everything results from that. That necessarily excludes everything that's immaterial, such as an immaterial God. Now, this gets us directly to Hume. And Hume famously said, you cannot derive an ought from an is. And so if all we are is just amalgamations of burnt out star stuff, if everything that about me, Barry Arrington, or you, Sean McDowell, is reducible to the chemicals that compose your physical bodies, well, you're fundamentally no different from a rock morally. There's no such thing as it's absurd to talk about an immoral or immoral rock. Well, materialist believes that fundamentally you're just another kind of rock, and that the carbon in your body and the other trace elements in your body is all you are. And therefore, there is no good, there's no moral basis, especially there's no transcendent God in whose being goodness can be grounded. That has ramifications.
Okay, keep
And
going.
one of the ramifications it has, and I was thinking about this. I was writing an article several years ago about critical theory, and I thought, well, these people believe that everything revolves around power dynamics. There's no good, there's no evil. There's just the weak and the strong, oppressors and oppressed. How can they believe this sort of thing? And then I thought, wait a minute. Critical theory is simply materialism applied to human relations. And if you accept that as your premise, their conclusions actually follow. And it really is that there's nothing governing human relations except power dynamics. That's what materialism ultimately teaches. Now, there have been various efforts to ground ethics and morality and things other than God in a materialist ethical system, if you will. They've all failed spectacularly, because at the end of the day, Hume was right. You cannot derive an ought from an is. And therefore, if materialism is correct, it really is about power, those who have it and those who don't.
Of course, you have a chapter in your book going into defending what you just said. And I've actually talked about that at length here. I've had debates with a number of atheist lawyers and thinkers like Michael Shermer making that case. So people can refer to your chapter, they can refer to my debates. But I agree with you in principle. In a materialistic universe, there's no soul, there's no free will. Objective meaning and objective purpose are an illusion. There's no life after death. There's no objective moral values and duties. I think that follows. Now, the obvious question, Barry, is that the vast majority of people committed to that worldview don't do what Harris and Klebold did. I have friends and extended family members who are materialists, and some of the best citizens and friends and people that I know. So why be concerned about a doctrine that we see this rare, terrible case, of course? I'm not downplaying it, but it feels like an exception as a whole to people who hold that worldview. Why be so concerned about it, especially when it was 25 years ago?
And so that's a very good question. And the answer is, you're right. Most people, the vast majority of materialists, do not act on their principles. As a matter of fact, it is a fact that if you're a materialist, you have to act. You base your life on the assumption or the working assumption, if you will, that your fundamental assumptions about reality are false. In the book, I have an interview between Richard Dawkins and the guys over at Trigonometry. I don't know if you see Trigonometry,
Interesting.
and Constantine asked Dawkins about this. He says, "Look, we all act as if we have free will, that we're free moral agents. Yet, and you, Richard Dawkins, you're one of the world's leading moralists and scolding moralists, and you're always saying this is right, this is wrong. Yet, if you take your philosophy seriously, and as a matter of fact, you have said that at bottom there is no good, there is no evil. How do you square that circle?" Richard Dawkins was at a loss. He couldn't square that circle, and hurried on and moved and wanted to talk about other things. And so the fact is, materialists don't act as if materialism is true by and large. And the reason for that, of course, is we believe as Christians that materialism isn't true, that God has placed in the heart of every human being a sense of what is right and what is wrong. Romans chapter 2 is very clear about this. But nevertheless, this idea of materialism is corrosive to our culture, especially in my field, the law, where about 130 years ago, it started to take over. And in politics and in our conception of our polity. And when you take materialism seriously in politics, you have to give up on the Declaration of Independence. So what do I mean by that? Well, the Declaration says it is self-evident that all men are created equal and that they're endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, including life and liberty and pursuit of happiness. Well, I quote in the book materialist authors who say, well, that's not only not self-evidently true, it's self-evidently false in a materialist world.
I had a friendly debate on the Unbelievable show, maybe, 6, 7 years ago with Ryan Bell, who was a pastor for 20 years. And then he was kind of trying on atheism for a year. And I know atheism is not always synonymous with materialism. It can be defined different ways. But I argued to him, I said, I don't think you're really living out for a year what a real atheism would imply. You're still borrowing certain things from the Christian worldview. If you were to live out atheism, this is what it would look like. Now, he pushed back, and folks can go watch that and make up their own minds. But I'm with you on asking the question. If there's no God, there's no soul, and materialism is true, what follows culturally and what follows personally? Now, I'm an apologist and evangelist, so the question about the cultural implications of this are important, but secondary to me as opposed to the personal, faith of an individual. You deal with both in this book. We will come back to your cultural critique, but you did say something in the book I wanted to push into a little bit. You said materialism has taken over the world. Direct quote. I actually see it a little bit differently. I think the supernatural seems to be making a cultural comeback. Whether it's UFOs sometimes be interpreted that way, interest in psychedelics, New Age beliefs. Is it both? Am I wrong? Why put so much emphasis on materialism when there's a lot of voices like Justin Brierley and others saying there's a surprising rebirth of belief in God?
So I don't think that you're wrong, Sean, but I think that these things are not incompatible. And matter of fact, one follows from the other. As our cultural elites, and especially our cultural institutions, law, politics, academia, the media, The overwhelming ethos amongst our elites is materialist. I mean, they just kind of take it for granted. And that trickles down to the society as a whole. And what we have seen is, unsurprisingly, as those people have had more and more influence, a precipitous rise in the nuns amongst polls on religion. Well, there's a saying widely attributed to G.K. Chesterton. When men stop believing in God, it's not that they believe in nothing, they'll believe in anything. But we all have a sense of the supernatural in us. C.S. Lewis called it the numinous. That there's just something uncanny about. No one really believes materialism. Everybody understands that there's something more than the physical. And when you reject the God of the Bible, you start looking for substitutes, and that's what we see with the rise of these New Age, for example, people trying to fill that hole. Now, on the other hand, we're also now seeing people are tired of the materialist shtick, and traditional religions seem to be making a comeback. I think the latest polls is that the nuns have bottomed out, and traditional religions making a comeback.
Okay, that's a helpful way to look at it. I think if you look statistically speaking in our country, it's a minority of people who really hold a materialist belief. I mean, maybe 4 to 7, 8%, depending upon the generation. But it seems like your concern is more with what you kind of consider these elite institutions and power brokers that shape law and culture. They're shaped by materialist beliefs that have powerful cultural implications. If I'm hearing you correctly, this is the case that you're making. So let me pull us to the chapter you have on one that was especially interesting to me. You have apologetics chapters, and I always find that interesting, especially from a lawyer, because you're trained to reason. That stuff I'm very familiar with. But this chapter, less so. I'm not a lawyer. And it was called Lawless Law. And you discuss what you consider the massive influence on the Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes. You refer to him as the most influential figure in American jurisprudence in the last 150 years. Who was he, and why were his writings and rulings so monumental and even still so today?
This is an excellent question. Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. Actually, there was 2 Oliver Wendell Holmes, as you know. One was the poet from the early 19th century. His son, Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., was a fascinating figure in American history, much less law. He started life as kind of vaguely religious, a northeastern Boston sort of religious family. He was an abolitionist, kind of idealistic, dropped out of Harvard to join the Union Army in the Civil War. He left the Supreme Court in 1934, I believe. So it's an interesting fact of history that we had a Civil War veteran, on the Supreme Court all the way through the 1930s. Wow. But what happened to him in the Civil War was life change. He was wounded 3 times. And so he went from being kind of an abolitionist, idealist person to an extreme materialist and a moral nihilist. He was definitely influenced by Darwin. He was definitely influenced by Spencer. And he came to adopt a view that there was no God, that there was no right, that there was no wrong. He was a nihilist, a thoroughgoing nihilist when it comes to moral issues. And he saw all of life, and in particular, all of human relations and the law specifically, as simply a Darwinistic struggle playing out. And that influenced him for the rest of his life. Now, how does that affect the law?
Yeah.
Well, we first have to understand where the law was before Holmes and after Holmes. Before Holmes, American law was primarily influenced by Blackstone, whose commentaries on the common law were the most influential book from the founding all the way through the second half of the 19th century. It influenced John Marshall, our original, and some say greatest Supreme Court Chief Justice. It influenced Lincoln. Just before he was inaugurated, someone asked him, what should I do to learn the law? He said, read Blackstone all the way through at least twice. And so it's still very, very influential. And why is that important? Because Blackstone's basic theory was a natural law theory. that the law exists, that God created these moral precepts that our law is based upon, and that they have a freestanding existence that judges and lawyers discover, quote unquote, discover. It's not made up. Fast forward to 1897, Holmes wrote an article called "The Path of the Law," still required reading when I was in law school.
Mm.
And in this article, he says it's time to give up on morality. Morality, it doesn't really exist. He didn't say that. It was still not quite able to say that he was basically channeling Darwin, Spencer, and Nietzsche. But he basically said nobody can agree on what morality is. And so we just need to jettison all words having moral implications from the law and treat it as what it is, in his view, as just power expressing itself. People who have power telling people who don't have power what to do. And that was a monumental change. Practically overnight, the law shifted from what is discovered through what God created to this is all man-made, all made up. And today, the overwhelming legal philosophical jurisprudence is something called legal positivism, which says the law is just what people who have power impose on other people. It has no necessary relation to morality.
That is a massive shift, in a sense, from moral law being embedded into the structure of the universe. It's our job to discover it through reason, through experience, through assessment, through reflection, through the tools of science, and then conform laws that line up with that natural law, the way the world is built. So in that view, law is like gravity, right? Gravity exists. We don't make laws. We could make a law to rule out gravity, but it wouldn't change objective reality. It would be foolish and have massive consequences to do so. You're saying that's the shift. We've gone from objective and discovery to subjective and create. And whoever has the power, so to speak, gets to create those laws for what reasons they deem being good. If that's the case, this sounds like Nietzsche applied to the law. Is that functionally what you're arguing? And then today, when you're saying unforgetting God, the point is we are culturally and personally untethered from an objective existence, an objective moral norm. And that's what's led to, I think, to quote you, tribalism in politics, lawlessness in our courts, crisis of meaning. Is that a fair summary of your assessment?
That's an incredibly fair summary. And if you trace the trajectory of the Supreme Court, slowly at first, but picking up steam in the 50s and 60s, you can see this. You know, you have the Living Constitution Project is essentially Holmesian legal positivism in practice. Basically, we don't care what the Constitution says. It's just a bunch of words on a piece of paper. Shouldn't bother us. If we have the power to change that, we will. And does it matter that the founders, the document that we purport to be interpreting, said something like what we are saying that it says? Doesn't matter to us. It's just about power. Some of the justices were very explicit about this. One of the most famous was William Brennan in his 5-finger rule. He kind of let the cat out of the bag once when he had Nat Hentoff in his office, and he was kind of saying, you know what? When one of my clerks comes into the office, get new ones every term, I hold up 5 fingers and I wave it like this. And I said, this is what this court's all about. 5 votes can do anything, whether it's in the Constitution or expressly forbidden by the Constitution. If I can get 5 of my people in this court to say otherwise, that's what the law is.
That's really interesting. In some ways, if you're right, should concern people on all sides of the aisle, that it's reducible to power and whoever is in power gets to decide it, untethered from moral law. So you're not taking a partisan position here per se. You're making a grander, bigger cultural assessment. Now, let me pinpoint.
Let me just add this. This
please.
Is what so you've heard about originalism in the Supreme Court.
Mm-hmm.
Originalism is trying to take the text of the Constitution seriously, and it's a reaction to people like William Brilling, who said we can do whatever we want to. We just make it up as we go under this Living Constitution project. Originalism is no. We are life tenured, unaccountable lawyers who've been placed on this court, and we don't get to tell the rest of the country what our strong policy preferences are under the guise of interpreting the Constitution. We have to take the text of the Constitution seriously. And there's only one way to do that. Actually read the text and what it means and apply that.
Okay, so I just want to put pause on something. Right now, some people are thinking, well, wait a minute. What about, executive orders that Obama gave or Trump has given? I would say put a pause on this. We're not giving a political argument here. We're making a meta point about the shift in culture over the past 150 years plus. And I want to make sure people think about your thesis before they get to those particulars. But can you connect one dot for me? So lawlessness in our courts makes total sense if there's no objective standard we're supposed to discover and conform our laws to. Crisis of meaning in our culture makes total sense about this if there's no God and no afterlife and no objective meaning and purpose because of materialism. I think that's the case. I had a friend of mine on, John Noyes, talking about suicide today. And one deep contributor, if not the primary one, is a loss of meaning and purpose in my life. Materialism obviously can massively contribute to that. But you also talk about...
Camus, the famous existentialist philosopher, said that the only serious question in philosophy under existentialism is whether to commit suicide.
That's a profound statement. Now, the one thing you also talk about is tribalism in our politics. I can think of a lot of contributors to why there might be tribalism in our politics. How do you connect the dots from materialism to tribalism in politics?
And so if we are grounding our politics, our ethics as a nation in the transcendent moral norms that have their ultimate grounding in God's existence, there are certain things that are on the table, certain things that are off the table. The Overton window is somewhat collared by those precepts. You can't take the rate of taxation. What's God say about the rate of tax? Well, we don't know. So I'm not talking about things like that. But is it okay to kill babies? Yeah, that's something that's just off the table. But if you get to a materialist position, I saw Charlie Kirk was debating this kid on a campus just last week. Is it okay? When can we stop killing babies if we can't stop killing them in their womb? Is there any limit? When they're about 2 years old. This kid said that. And so if there is no transcendent moral norm that's governing our relations as a society, politics devolves into a war of all against all. And that is the definition of tribalism. People with competing interests just kind of amalgamate and fight the other tribes. That's the reason that we have such tribalism in our politics today, is because nothing is off the table.
I think someone could make the connection from, if there's no God, I'm not made in God's image, and which would imply that my identity and my value comes from what God says about me and how he has made me to be. If you get rid of that, then identity is going to be grounded in something else. Maybe it's my individual feelings. Maybe it is my political party. So in some ways, you could argue that if we've lost this transcendent, immaterial sense of who and what we are, something's going to fill the void, and tribalism in politics does so. Now, before we move on to the last question, just personal note for me is I wish I could say, you know what? When we look outside the church, they're the ones who are tribalistic in politics, but we in the church are not. Practically speaking, that just is not true. We have bought lock, stock, and barrel into identity in politics and not dealt with that well within the church and become tribalistic, sadly. So I just don't want this podcast to pick on those outside without reflecting inside and going, we have a serious issue inside first. but that's a topic for another conversation. You have a term you call cut flower culture. Tell us what you mean by that term and why you think America is a cut flower culture.
So, cut flower culture, Will Herberg coined this phrase, and basically it's consider the flowers that you get from the florist. They're beautiful, right? You stick them in water, and for a few days, they're just gorgeous. But ultimately, they've been cut off from their source of sustenance, the ground and the minerals and the water that gave them life, and they wilt and die. Cultures are the same way in this sense, that if you cut American culture or the Western culture more generally off from its Judeo-Christian roots, can you hope to sustain the beauty of the Western cultural project incorporated in particular in the Declaration of Independence, in the absence of the Judeo-Christian worldview upon which that was rooted and grounded? And the answer is probably not. And if for example, John David Danielson just wrote us this book called Pagan America, in which he says, as the influence of Christianity, and it's particularly this idea that we're all made in the image of God, recedes, what's coming to take its place? Well, the idea that the weak should not be oppressed, that women have value, that children have value, that we should not enslave people, that the strong should not just dominate the weak. That's second nature to Christians. To the Greeks and Romans, from which Christianity sprung, it would have been totally alien. And his thesis of his book is what we're seeing as Christianity recedes, this idea that the strong oppress the weak is coming back to the fore.
Mm. The idea of cut flower is really interesting, that a flower can maintain its beauty for a while, but only so long without its source. And the question is, if there's certain ideas that are unique to the Judeo-Christian tradition, which doesn't imply that we were a Christian nation, that is a separate issue, but philosophically, the idea of human rights, which are not material things, the idea of equality, which is not a material thing, these are rooted in our Constitution, not practiced, that's for sure, but built into the Constitution. Can we maintain those rights and values if we cut off its source? That seems to be the heart of what you're asking and you're wrestling with. Maybe clarify for us, because I think right away some people are thinking, okay, this guy is a disguised Christian nationalist. Now that term is so, I think, equivocal and ambiguous, and I've had at least 3 conversations and debates on that, on people for and against, on my YouTube channel. But what exactly are you arguing? Since you're a lawyer, you're saying we need laws now that reflect the Bible. Is this a disguised form of Christian nationalism? Maybe clarify that for us.
So nowhere in the book do I say that we need laws that reflect the Bible, but I do think that we have to have an underlying presupposition that rights talk is real. And let me tell you what I mean by that. If you're a materialist, and the overwhelming majority, I believe, in our intelligentsia, the people who are running the heights of our cultures and the law and the media, for example, academia, if they're at least functional materialists, if not out and out confessing materialists. And so this all came to the fore, speaking of Christian nationalism, and I write about this in the book, in an interview I saw with Heidi Pritzbilla about a year ago. And she was sounding the warning klaxon against Christian nationalists. And the interviewer, I think this was on MSNBC, said, well, what's this Christian nationalist? Who are these people? And she said, well, Christian nationalists are people who believe our rights come from God instead of the Supreme Court or Congress. And so you got to be careful for those people. And I thought to myself, and she caused kind of a firestorm of controversy because, well, if that's the case, our founders were Christian nationalists because that's what they believed. That's what the Declaration says. And Pritzbilla had not really thought this through because what does it mean to have a right, Sean? To have a right means that you are treated in the way that you ought to be treated in a just way by the government. Well, that has meaning only if ought and just have objective meaning. And that has objective meaning only if God exists. And so we, as Christians, as theists generally, Martin Luther King Jr., as a matter of fact, appealed to this natural rights theory in his letter from the Birmingham jail. He says, the law that transcends God's law is no law at all. And he quoted Augustine and Aquinas for that. Well, what's the alternative? Well, again, you go back to positivism, legal positivism. Only the government grants your rights. Well, the government grants your rights and take them away. And the ultimate expression of that in our time was Nazi Germany. Did you know the Holocaust was not illegal? It was not illegal in the sense that it did not violate any of the internal laws of Germany at the time. And so the German says that, the Jews have no right to life. And we are the ones who say what rights are, and we're taking that one away. Well, I don't think that's a place we want to go.
Now, I don't think Hitler was a materialist, but you're saying this view of law follows from a materialist understanding of the law. And I think the point that you're making, just want to clarify, is that if somebody defines Christian nationalism as someone who thinks our rights come from God, then you're guilty, I'm guilty, the framers were guilty of being Christian nationalists. The positive about that is if our rights come from God and not the law, then the laws are supposed to reflect the inherent right that I have. I have a right to freedom of religion. I have a right to free speech. Those are inherent in being human. So that didn't come from the law. So the law cannot take those away. Get rid of God.
Come from the government, so the government can't take those away.
Through the laws. Yes, thank you.
That's
Good
right.
clarification. So that's really helpful. Typically, the concern with Christian nationalism is when somebody starts to argue, for example, that America is a favored nation like Israel was a favored nation, and the promises to Israel apply uniquely to the United States. That's where theologically even Christians say, pause, time out, that's going too far. That's one of the areas of concern. But you say you're not arguing for that.
I don't believe that.
Yeah,
so
you don't believe that. Okay, good.
Yeah.
I just want to clarify. Let me unpack a couple things that you say. So it's like the second half of your book, or maybe the last third, is really an apologetics book. So you're kind of critiquing culture that it's forgotten God. And your solution is you actually say to be more skeptical about materialism and that the evidence is that God exists. So this is more of a personal project for people to ask the question, do I believe in God and why? Kind of a bottom-up one rather than a top-down political movement that you're calling for. That's the way that I read it. You have a provocative line in your book. You say materialists have to believe crazy things. Now, Barry, Christians believe crazy things. We believe that donkeys talked and dead people rise from the grave. So is this just true for both, or do you think materialists believe crazier things?
So this section of the book, Materialists Believe Crazy Things, comes from my friend Granville Sewell, who's a professor at UTEP. And he writes that if you're a materialist, you have to believe that the fundamental forces of the universe operating on the fundamental particles spontaneously rearranged such that we now have airplanes and nuclear power plants and Apple iPhones and computers, because that's the only creative power that materialists are allowed to have, right? The fundamental particles being manipulated by the fundamental forces. I say that that's crazy because blind, undirected forces demonstrably do not have the creative power to result in the observed effect. That's why that's crazy. You just can't get to that staggering specified complexity through a blind process. Now, are the miracles of the Bible crazy in the same way? No, they're not. Absolutely not. Because the miracles of the Bible are attributed to a God who uses those miracles to accomplish his purposes. Well, Barry said that just pushes the question back to, does God exist? Well, in a sense that it does, but certainly the cause that is posited can account for the effect that is observed, and therefore it's not crazy to believe that that cause can create that effect. It's a different question where God does he exist? And of course, there's overwhelming evidence that he does exist. And as you pointed out in a recent debate, you actually have to prove that God doesn't exist in order to say that miracles are crazy or are not possible.
That was the debate I had at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, a conversation with a wonderful professor, Paul Rinsler, who's an atheist there. It was a great conversation that we had. So I agree with your assessment here. The bigger questions are, can you get life from non-life, something from nothing, consciousness from matter? There's no naturalistic explanation for any of those phenomena. And yet we know
all of them together, right?
Yeah, and we know intelligent minds can create these kinds of phenomena. So it's not a God of the gaps. It's a recognition that there's no naturalistic explanation, but these have the signs of intelligence. So if there is a God who's created the universe, created life from non-life, and made a donkey, it's actually not crazy that God could choose to use a donkey to talk. On its surface, it seems crazy. But if we deal with the first questions first, it's really not. God will not be limited by this. So the way you frame it, I would agree with that. Let me ask you this question. So I've been, in some ways, there's a couple things at play. There's the evidence that we make for the existence of God. And I think the case is strong and convincing for those with eyes to see and ears to hear. That's my assessment of it. And I know you agree. But one of the reasons we have such a lack, those arguments don't often land, is in the church, we just have so little credibility in the eyes of many people. And one reason, it feels like almost every week, there's going to be a new pastor, a new musician, a new apologist who just fails to live out the Christian faith. So I'm curious how you respond to the objection that materialists can be good people and Christ followers can be horrible people.
And any apologetic has to deal with this question, and I deal with it in the book. One of the things that's always, in addition to personal failures that you mentioned, are the wars of religion. Those were Christians fighting Christians, and people were dying, and those sorts of things. And there's some standard answers to the war of religion. Well, it was not really about religion so much. Religion was used by secular rulers for accomplishing their own purposes and used religion as a crutch. Or if you really want to get into wholesale slaughter of people through war, look at the secular atheist regimes in the 20th century and the tens of millions that died there. But I conclude ultimately in the book, whataboutism and deflection doesn't really get you there. What does get you there? And the answer is, don't follow Christians, follow Christ. And I use the story of the Good Samaritan to kind of make this example. The story of the Good Samaritan obviously is about helping people, but more importantly, it's about who was doing the helping. That the other, the hated minority other, was actually the one who helped when the religious leaders refused to help. This is the story that Christ told to say, go do that. Go follow that example. Don't follow the example of the religious leaders. And so my answer to that is, don't follow Christians, including this one. We all have feet of clay. Follow Christ. And that is why the whole idea of Christian, if you want a religious movement that's full of just perfect people, you're going to search in vain, because none of them are. Well, what about this idea that atheists and materialists can behave in immoral ways? Well, the Bible predicts that. That's not something that surprises anybody. In Romans chapter 2, Paul says that God has put his law on every human heart. And the Christian worldview is everybody, even if they deny it, knows the difference between right and wrong and acts towards the right.
Interestingly, the Bible does say we have an awareness right from wrong, but it also says no one is good, no, not one. And it's
We
the
do not
root of
measure
the
up.
problem in the world is human brokenness. And the older I get, the more I look at the world and reflect on my own heart, the more I think Jesus diagnosed the problem of the heart exactly right. Barry, I have one last question for you. I thought it was interesting towards the end of your book, you dealt with artificial intelligence, which everybody's talking about right now. And I've heard some argument that, look, we can see a kind of intelligence taking on a life of its own, that artificial intelligence has become, we have artificial general intelligence now. It's functioning the way human beings function, or at least we're close to it. Does that seem to push back against the idea that God has created us as conscient agents and we need an intelligent being to create us, and that we're just meat robots?
And so that's a very, very big question, and we don't have a lot of time to get into the answers. I'll limit myself to just a few responses. And the primary one is that, well, I'll just recommend everybody go read Bob Mark's book, Non-Computable You, where he demonstrates, he's a computer scientist from Baylor, and he demonstrates how computers will never be conscious in the way that you and I are conscious. And why is that? Because fundamentally, the only thing that computers do is operate algorithms. And then what's an algorithm? It's just a list of instructions. John Searle's Chinese room thought experiment has never really been answered. What is that? So Searle posits a room where there are a bunch of files with Chinese characters, and someone on the outside of the room passes a Chinese character message in, and a person looks at it, and he looks at those characters, doesn't understand what they mean, but he goes to each of the files and batches them, and then has an answer that he passes through the door. And the person on the other side thinks that someone who understood Chinese answered the question, when nobody inside the Chinese room understood the question or the answer. They just ran an algorithm. Well, think of a computer as just a massive, very, very, very fast Chinese room. And so computers are not conscious. They're just very fast algorithm running machines. Now, you have the Turing test. Well, what is the Turing test? Alan Turing said that if you have a computer and a person and there's a blind conversation with judges, and the judges can't tell the difference between the computer and the person, the computer will be perceived to be conscious just like the person. The key word there is perceived to be. Computers are now very close to, if have not passed, the Turing test and are perceived to be conscious.
Yeah.
But you have to keep in mind that that's a perception, and they're not the same as our consciousness. I'll give an example in the book. Say I put a light meter on the porch, aim it at the western horizon, and I hook it to a computer that runs a program. When the sun rises, or sets rather, speak these words: "That was a beautiful sunset." And then a guy over here looks at the sun, and it's setting, and he says, "That's a beautiful sunset." Did the same thing happen? Obviously not. The computer ran an algorithm, had no feeling, no subjective experience of the sunset. And philosophers of mind call these qualia. Computers, by definition, cannot have subjective experience of phenomena. They can describe them only.
Yeah, that's a really good distinction. I think when it's all said and done, artificial intelligence mimics human intelligence
Exactly.
and is going to get increasingly better at trying to convince us, or potentially convincing us. I said try, but artificial intelligence doesn't try anything. It's just an algorithm. But it's not actually intelligence. And by the way, obvious point is A friend asked me one time, he said, what if, scientists could make life from non-life? Would that disprove the idea that only God made life? I said, no, it shows intelligence is necessary to go from non-life to life. Artificial intelligence is not the result of material processes, but minds created in building it. And it traces back to a mind. That's an important point as well. Barry, I've got a ton more questions for you. I enjoyed your book, provocatively titled Unforgetting God, and I hope Christians will pick it up, wrestle with it. I hope some skeptics will pick it up and just wrestle with it. If they do, write a review, write a response to some of this stuff. And if you tag me, I will certainly share it with Barry, and maybe he'll write a response to some of the critiques in the future or something. But pick up a copy of Unforgetting God. It's a cultural critique and an apologetics book written uniquely from somebody with high-level legal training, assessing these arguments from the perspective of a lawyer. Barry, really enjoyed it, but before we click away, I want folks to make sure they hit subscribe. We've got other conversations like this coming up soon. You won't want to miss. And these, we've kind of scratched on the surface of the very arguments we go into in depth in our program here at Biola Talbot School of Theology. We love people watching to consider joining us. We have a distance program, on-campus, top-rated apologetics program. Information is below, and a certificate program if you're not ready for a master's, but I want someone to walk me through learning this stuff. It's in the description. Barry, this is a lot of fun. Thanks for writing a very intriguing book and for a good conversation.
Thank you, Sean. It's been a lot of fun. Thank you.